Right. So when we talk about the image of God, it's one of those slippery, strange labels that we as modern people might struggle to understand. So we're going to go back in order to grasp it. We're going to go back to the last part of the first creation story. It's actually the first verse or two of Genesis chapter 2. And we're going to scramble around the Bible for a little bit and hopefully get a better understanding of what the Bible means when they talk about the image of God. Because when we think about it, usually the image of something is like something that looks like them. Like I might have, for a brief moment, thought that I was made in the image of God back when I was in high school and lifting weights and, the body of a God or something like that. But obviously, that's not what that means. So this is at the end of Genesis, it's technically Genesis 2, but end of the first creation story, the story where God creates the earth in 7 days. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." So the big question here is, what does this mean that God rests? Like, was he tired and needed to take a nap? Or was the process of this creation like stressful, so God needed some me time where he like pour a pitcher of margarita and lay by the pool or something? No, obviously the infinite, ineffable creator of the universe does not get tired. He does not need a nap. He does not need a break. So to understand what it means for God to rest, we need to bounce around to somewhere else in the Bible. And I've just picked one section from a psalm, but just know that this is all over the Hebrew Bible. It's one of those really interesting, consistent themes. This is a Psalm 132 about, it's a psalm of worship, worshiping God in his temple. It said, "Let us go to God's dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool, saying, 'Arise, Lord, and come to your resting place. You are the ark, you and the ark of your might, for the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling, saying, This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it.'" Isn't that interesting? God dwelling in his temple is equated with God resting. So, like I said, this is all over, like in the Psalms especially, but also in the prophets, that when God rests, it is not disengagement, it is not taking a nap, but rather it is God dwelling. It is all about God's presence, which means that on the seventh day in creation, when God rests, he dwells. He takes up his residence. His presence comes down to earth, which, if you can kind of guess from this psalm, that makes his creation a temple. That God constructs or creates this earth, and at the end, we realize that his intention all along was to have this earth as the place where he rests. It is his sacred space, his temple. And if you were to go back in time, kind of what we know about the worldview of the ancient Israelites and actually the people in the ancient Near East, if you were to read to them like this story as it ends with God resting, they would say, "Oh, you're talking about a temple, but in this case, the temple is God's creation." Now, there are loads of things we can say, but I'll just say a couple of things. One, this is a slap in the face by Israel to like pretty much everybody else in the area. They all had their gods, like little gods, and they all had their temples. And so, if you would ask them, well, where is your God? Where is Shamash? They'd say, well, he's like 2 miles that way in the temple, if they, had miles or whatever. And this is true for like Egyptians and Babylonians and Assyrians and Canaanites. They all had their little gods. But think about what this is saying. No. God's temple is creation because he's the God that created it. Now, later on, God will instruct them to build a tabernacle and then a temple. But this seems like a concession. Like, fine, you can't conceive of my presence in other ways. And there was always this tension that, like, okay, God dwells in his temple, but can he really be contained? The infinite God of the universe? Can he be contained in that little place? No. So that means that God establishes his creation in a way that the ancient people could understand, but it says that God intended for this place to be where he dwells. And this makes some kind of intuitive sense. Now, for years, I've consistently heard from people, and it's usually people who are not connected with the church, that when they're talking about their spiritual life, they would say that they feel closest to God or they sense God's presence more closely when they are out in nature, like in the grand majesty of the mountains and the valleys and the hills that go to Yosemite or something like that. And there they have this sense that this is sacred, this is special. You find God sitting on a surfboard, waiting for the next set to come in, enjoying this sacred space because God created it in such a way that he would always dwell here. Now, going back in time again, there would be a certain expectation, a part of their worldview, that if God creates, or God has this temple and God dwells in this temple, everybody except for the Israelites would have a sense that before this can happen, a representative of this God, or representation, an idol, would need to be placed in this sacred space so that when people walked in, they would know who they're talking or who they're worshiping. Like you go in and there's this spindly weird guy cast in bronze sitting on this throne. You know, that's Baal, the Canaanite fertility deity, or something like that. This is just how they saw the world. In the same way that you know that halfway through the seventh inning, everyone's going to stand up and they're going to belt out, "Take me out to the ball game." It's just part of our existence in the Western world. Now, the Israelites, as God is revealing who he is, has this same story, but they subvert it. God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." Instead of some idol, some vain, like ridiculous, created by human hands representation of the deity, God gives that honor to human beings. So that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God is taking an ancient idea and he is subverting it. And he is saying, you, like you, y'all, are created in the image of God, which means your role in creation is to subdue it, to rule over it, to create within it, to develop and cultivate it in such a way that you reflect the fact that its creator is filled with wisdom and grace. So that in this weird sense, all of creation would look at you, at us, its image, God's image, and say that, oh, that is what God is like. As we live out as ambassadors or vice regents or caretakers of God's sacred space, his creation. Excuse me. That is what it means to bear God's image. And we can't help but do it. We, as the bearers of God's image, naturally have a tremendous amount of power over our space. It is within us, like just in our bones, to build and construct, to create and to express, because originally we were to do so in a way that reflected the God who made us. That is what it means to bear God's image, and we do it well. Think about the art that we have created as image bearers. Now, I'm not a visual arts person, though I certainly appreciate it. That one's more my level, like the dogs playing poker. I get that one. But I mean, think about the art that we have created that captivates us. Like, I'm not a super visual person, but I love this painting. It communicates so much so well because it is made by somebody who bears God's image. Now, I will tell you about my favorite work of art. I don't know what it's called, and I don't know who did it. But it was in Houston, in this museum that my wife kind of dragged me to. And on the right side were this huge collection of ancient art, ancient artifacts. And on the left side was like the weird modern art. And so we walk in, and of course, I cut really hard to the right because that's what I like. And my wife is very in tune with art. She understands it on a deep level and interacts with it well. So she was at the left. And eventually I decided, all right, I should probably go and hang out with her. And so she's looking at this one piece. And, to the right it says like oil-based paints or oil paints on canvas. And I look at it, and it's just it's all black, painting on canvas. At that point, I throw my hands up in the air and said, that's it, I'm out, this is ridiculous. Somebody painted a canvas black and then decided that was art. And then Katie, my wife, goes, no, but look closer. Look it in. And then you realized, suddenly, there were no brushstrokes. The painter managed to paint this canvas black and leave no trace of themselves. With oil paint, you could see no brushstrokes, no texture other than the texture of the canvas. So in that regard, this painting was perfect. And suddenly you realize the amount of talent and cultivated skill and the time it takes to build into that skill to be able to paint so perfectly and express it so purely that you can use one color and leave no trace of yourself. And then you realize, wow, this is what it means to bear God's image. Taking what he gives you and cultivating that skill and that talent to express something. Now, if art isn't your thing, we could always go to engineering. It took all of human history till 1903 to achieve powered flight. And I think it was like a minute or something, I don't remember. And that was a huge feat. But think about it like this. All of human history until 1903, and then 66 years later, we landed on the moon. That is an insane time frame. That image bearers, whether they knew it or not, were engaging in this image-bearing activity of building and discovering and learning and constructing and cultivating and bringing order to this sacred space of creation that God has placed us in, as we are representatives of God. Now, just so we don't get too cocky and think we modern technological people have it all figured out, did you know that Cleopatra, of like Elizabeth Taylor fame or whatever, but Cleopatra lived closer to the landing on the moon than she did to the building of the pyramids of Giza? These things are old, and we have no idea really how they did it. We have some guesses. And even the Romans, like 2,000 years ago, they had a recipe for making concrete that dried in water. And that recipe was lost to history until, I think, like 10 years ago. Just because we have the technology doesn't mean that the ancient people weren't geniuses. Living out, again, whether they knew it or not, this natural inclination to bear God's image, to build, create, express, to bring a sense of order to God's creation. That is what we are. We have remote-controlled robots, and we have one of them on Mars. That is astounding. And of course, we land on Mars, and what do? We take a selfie. That's what that is. You, as bearers of God's image, in whatever you do, and you will do this naturally, you will connect with people. You will build, you will create, you will express, because you are representatives of this infinite, ineffable creator God who created this world to be his sacred space and make you his representatives. Now, we know how this story goes because the story doesn't end here. That God creates two human beings special and places them in this garden, the Garden of Eden, and there's like an infinite number of connections between the Garden of Eden and the temple on Mount Zion, and if we had 3 hours, we could go into it. It is fascinating, but point being, God gives them their charge, create, subdue, it's basically cultivate and keep this garden, basically bear God's image. But he says, don't eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now that might seem kind of odd, because like if somebody tells me, don't do something, well, now that's the only thing I want to do. Or like you put a cake on a kitchen table and say to a bunch of 4-year-olds, now don't go anywhere near that, I'll be in the other room for an hour. I mean, you'll be cleaning frosting out of your kitchen for a year. But it's not like that, because the knowledge of good and evil is a good thing, right? Like as I raise my 6-year-old, I want him to have the knowledge of good and evil, so that someday when he is presented with a choice, he will choose good and not evil. And I've been told eventually they will do that. I'm kidding. He's actually a pretty good kid. But so God says, do not eat from this tree. On the day that you do it, you will surely die. And there's this serpent that enters into the scene, and the Bible doesn't explain where this serpent came from, at least not in any specific way. It's just this dark, shadowy thing. And he starts taunting and tempting this man and this woman. And he says about the fruit of this tree, you will not certainly die. The serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So another way of talking about the knowledge of good and evil is with the word wisdom. But with this taunt or this temptation, I think we have a better sense of what he's saying. You will be like God. You will be grasping the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil for yourself. In other words, you will be deciding what wisdom is for yourselves. You will choose what is good and what is evil. And that is a bad thing. How much pain and suffering in our lives is the result of us defining wisdom for ourselves? Us saying, you know what, this is what is good and I'm going to do this apart from God. How many other people have made this same decision in your life and it has wrecked relationships and it has caused financial pain? The answer is a lot. See, when God's representatives, his ambassadors, his vice regents, his images, start defining wisdom for themselves apart from God, then we have a very big problem. The image no longer represents the person or the being it is supposed to represent. The image breaks, it crumbles, it falls apart, it decays. And we can see this playing out in our own lives. We have immense power over creation, and we don't always use that power in a wise way. We will decide what is the wise way to use the resources God has given us, and this results sometimes in things like rivers that are ecologically dead, or like lakes, and this has happened, lakes that are so polluted. Remember, this is a lake, a body of water that is so polluted that it is caught on fire. Or as you see this story play out later, and I encourage you to go back and read through it, once they start deciding and eating from this tree on their own, like their relationships shatter, and they start blaming each other. Or we start to realize that work is hard. There's this enmity, this frustration between image bearer and creation that just makes life painful. In the words of one of my favorite poets, Yeats, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. And so, us as image bearers no longer fully and truly bear God's image. That image is broken. It's shattered. It's cracked. It's just a shadow of its former self. And we can see this in our own lives as relationships are hard. It can be hard to live intimately with other people. Work is hard. Work is a pain. The things that you do as image bearers naturally will also kind of work against you. Because we as image bearers no longer really reflect God's wisdom, because we tend to choose our own wisdom. We define what is good and what is evil. Now, it makes perfect logical sense that if God were to rehabilitate or remake the image of God, he would do it by a human. Someone who perfectly bears God's image. And that's why Paul picks up on this in Colossians. He's talking about Jesus. Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. That in Jesus, suddenly divinity itself that is born, infinity that is born and has a mother, bears God's image perfectly, and it is no wonder that human history has never been the same since. And as you read through the life of Jesus, you realize, well, yeah, this man is miraculous, but this is also what humanity should be, the firstborn over all creation. Like maybe when Jesus calms the storm that threatens to capsize the boat that he and his disciples are in, maybe that is, yes, it's a miracle, it's God's action, but maybe that is also what it looks like when a perfect image bearer perfectly reflects God's wisdom and grace over creation. Or when Jesus heals somebody who is physically sick and broken, that maybe this is, yes, it's a miracle, but maybe this is also what happens when a perfect image bearer encounters an image that has been broken and decayed and shattered. So he continues, for by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This perfect image and this perfect image bearer has a special place in creation. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. That is temple language, by the way. And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. That this perfect image bearer comes to rescue the brokenness of shattered images. That this Jesus, by the power of his sacrifice, his death, the shedding of his blood, now is remaking image bearers. That he formed this group of his followers that we call the church, people that have passed through death in Jesus by our baptism and into new life. We are now a group of people that are seeking to live as renewed image bearers. That even though we ourselves still have this broken sense about us, we bear God's image imperfectly. That by Jesus' own death and resurrection, we bear God's image, that our image-bearing capacity is being remade, that statue, that representation is being put back together. And that one day we will stand again as perfect bearers of God's image, reflecting that wisdom and that grace to once again rule over God's creation, his sacred space. Let's pray.